He never expected that a simple delivery job would expose a secret powerful enough to rewrite his entire life. Because the moment a poor single father looked up at the wall of a billionaire CEO's office and saw his daughter's photograph framed in gold, he realized that someone he had never met knew his child better than he ever imagined. On a cold autumn morning in a quiet American town where dreams felt too expensive to chase, Ethan Carter tightened the worn straps of his delivery bag and stared at the towering glass skyscraper rising above the city like a monument to a world he didn't belong to, a world of polished shoes, quiet elevators, and people who spoke in numbers instead of emotions. He had spent most of his life fighting gravity, pulling himself and his daughter upward from the weight of hospital bills, overdue rent, and sleepless nights. And yet here he was, stepping into Sterling Tech's headquarters not as a guest, but as a ghost passing through a palace he would never own, his mind heavy with thoughts of Lily, his 7-year-old daughter whose laughter could brighten the darkest days, and whose fragile heart condition could shatter them just as quickly. And as the automatic doors closed behind him with a soft hiss, he felt the familiar sting of invisibility, the kind that came from being poor in a place built for the powerful. But he forced a polite smile at the receptionist, signed the clipboard with shaky handwriting, and waited as his eyes wandered across marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and walls decorated with futuristic art, until something inexplicable made him stop mid-step, his breath catching in his throat as if the air itself had suddenly turned to glass. Because among the abstract paintings and corporate awards, there was a photograph that didn't belong, a small, simple frame that seemed almost out of place in the luxurious hallway. And inside it was a little girl with warm brown eyes, a crooked smile, and hair that refused to stay neat no matter how carefully it was brushed. Lily. Unmistakably Lily. And for a moment Ethan wondered if exhaustion had finally driven him into hallucination. But the closer he moved, the clearer the truth became. Every detail matching the child he had kissed goodbye that morning before rushing to work. The same dimple on her left cheek. The same faint scar near her eyebrow from a playground fall. The same expression she made when she was trying not to laugh. And his heart began to pound so violently that he felt it in his ears, his palms sweating as he stared at the frame like it was a mirror showing a life he didn't understand. And in that moment, the hallway seemed to shrink, the voices around him fading into a distant echo while 1,000 questions collided inside his mind. Who took this picture? Why was it here? How did they know Lily? And before he could stop himself, his voice broke the silence, shaky but urgent, as he turned toward the young assistant at the desk and asked the question that would change everything. "Excuse me, why is my daughter's picture on your wall?" The assistant froze as if someone had pulled the plug on her composure, her eyes darting from the frame to Ethan's face, then toward the glass doors of the executive office. And the hesitation in her expression told Ethan something was terribly wrong, because people didn't hesitate over innocent questions unless the answer was dangerous. And within seconds, the elevator doors opened behind him with a soft chime. Footsteps approached, and the room seemed to shift as if gravity itself had tilted, because walking toward them was Victoria Sterling, the legendary CEO whose name appeared on business magazines and billion-dollar deals, a tall, poised blonde woman with eyes sharp enough to command boardrooms and a presence that made conversation stop mid-sentence. And as she moved through the hallway, employees instinctively straightened their posture. But when her gaze landed on Ethan, something unexpected happened. Her confident stride slowed, her expression faltered for just a fraction of a second, and when she followed his line of sight to the framed photograph, her face lost its corporate armor, revealing something raw and human beneath the polished exterior. And Ethan felt an uncomfortable chill crawl up his spine as their eyes met, because in that brief silence, he sensed that this wasn't coincidence. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a random decoration on a wall. It was a story that had been waiting for him. And as Victoria stopped a few steps away, the assistant stepped back nervously, the hallway holding its breath while the most powerful woman in the building stared at a struggling single father like she had been expecting him all along. And then, in a voice so quiet it barely carried across the marble floor, yet so heavy it seemed to press against his chest, she said words that no stranger should ever know how to say. "You're her father." And in that instant, Ethan felt the ground beneath his feet disappear, because the world he understood, the world of long shifts, cheap groceries, and hospital waiting rooms, suddenly collided with a world of secrets, wealth, and unanswered questions. And as he stood there staring at the woman who somehow knew his child, he realized that this was not the beginning of a conversation, but the opening of a truth that had been hidden from him for 7 years. A truth that would force him to confront not only the past he thought he understood, but the possibility that Lily's life, and his own, had been quietly watched, shaped, and perhaps even controlled by someone he had never met. And while the skyscraper continued to hum with business as usual around them, Ethan felt his heart whisper a terrifying realization. If his daughter's picture was on the wall of a billionaire CEO, then Lily's story was never just his alone. And whatever secret Victoria Sterling was about to reveal would change everything he believed about love, fate, and the price of survival. The silence that followed Victoria Sterling's words felt heavier than any sound, as if the polished walls of her headquarters had absorbed every noise just to witness what was about to unfold. And Ethan Carter stood frozen in the middle of the hallway with his hands clenched into fists, his mind racing faster than his heart could keep up, because there were only two possibilities. Either this powerful woman was dangerously mistaken, or she knew something about his daughter that he didn't, and neither option felt safe. And before he could speak, Victoria turned slightly toward her assistant and said calmly, "Clear my schedule." A simple sentence that carried the weight of command, and within seconds the assistant nodded and disappeared, leaving Ethan alone with the most influential woman he had ever met, a woman who now seemed less like a distant CO and more like someone who had been waiting for him. And without another word, Victoria opened the glass door to her office and gestured for him to enter, her expression unreadable, and Ethan hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside, because walking away was no longer an option. He had spent years fighting for Lily, and he would not turn his back on the truth now, even if it terrified him. The office was quiet, spacious, and filled with sunlight that poured through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Yet despite the luxury, it felt strangely personal, with bookshelves lined not just with business awards but with framed photographs, handwritten notes, and objects that hinted at a life beyond corporate success. And as the door closed behind them with a soft click, Ethan felt as if he had crossed an invisible boundary into a story that had been unfolding without him. And Victoria walked toward her desk slowly, as though each step required effort, before stopping in front of the framed photograph of Lily that now sat on a side table beside a sleek silver lamp, her fingers brushing the glass with a tenderness that made Ethan's chest tighten. And for several seconds neither of them spoke, until Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound calm. "You said I'm her father, so you must know who she is. Tell me how." And Victoria didn't look at him immediately, instead staring at the city skyline as if searching for words in the distance. And when she finally turned, the confidence that usually defined her seemed to have softened into something fragile, something human, and she said quietly, 7 years ago, a private medical research institute approached my company with a proposal. They were studying rare pediatric heart conditions, looking for genetic patterns that could change the future of treatment. And at the mention of heart conditions, Ethan felt his stomach drop, because Lily's illness had always felt like a shadow that followed him everywhere. And he suddenly realized that this conversation was not just about coincidence. It was about something far deeper. Victoria walked to a cabinet, opened it, and pulled out a thin folder, placing it gently on the desk between them. And when Ethan saw Lily's name typed across the cover, his breath caught in his throat, because he had never seen her name printed in such an official, cold format before. And as Victoria opened the folder and slid it toward him, she continued, "Your wife, Emma, volunteered for an anonymous genetic study during her pregnancy. It was legal, confidential, and approved by the hospital. At the time, neither of us knew who you were, and I didn't know your daughter personally." And Ethan stared at the documents, his hands shaking as he flipped through pages filled with medical terminology he barely understood. Yet every line seemed to confirm that Lily had been observed, analyzed, and documented long before he realized anyone else knew her story. And suddenly memories of Emma's late-night phone calls and unexplained hospital visits flashed through his mind, moments he had dismissed as routine checkups, but now felt like pieces of a puzzle he had never been allowed to see. And when he looked up at Victoria, His voice was strained. "So you track my daughter because of research?" And for the first time, Victoria's composure cracked, her eyes darkening as she shook her head slowly. "No," she said, her voice lower now. "At first, it was research. But that's not why her picture is on my wall." And she walked across the office to another frame on a shelf and turned it toward him, revealing the photograph of a teenage boy with a shy smile and eyes that looked hauntingly familiar. And before Ethan could ask, Victoria spoke again, her words heavy with emotion she could no longer hide. "This is my son, Daniel. He died 6 years ago." And the room seemed to shrink as she said it, the city outside fading into irrelevance, because in her voice was a grief that no amount of wealth could erase. And she continued, "Daniel had the same rare heart condition Lily has. We didn't know until it was too late. One day he collapsed, and within hours he was gone." And Ethan felt the weight of her confession settle over him like a storm, because he knew that fear too well. The fear of losing Lily, the fear that every cough or faint smile might be a warning sign. And Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she held the frame, her polished image replaced by something painfully real. "When I saw Lily's medical profile in the research data," she whispered, "it felt like the universe was giving me a second chance, not to replace my son, but to save someone I couldn't save before." And Ethan felt his anger and confusion collide with unexpected sympathy, because for the first time he saw not a billionaire CEO, but a mother who had lost a child. And yet the question still burned in his mind. "If you knew all this," he asked quietly, "why didn't you contact us?" And Victoria met his gaze, her voice steady but full of regret. "The research agreement was legally binding. I wasn't allowed to reach out to your family. And honestly, I was afraid." And Ethan frowned. "Afraid of what?" And she hesitated before answering. "Afraid that if I got too close, I would lose her too." And her words hung in the air like a confession she had carried for years. And Ethan suddenly understood that the framed photograph on the wall was not evidence of surveillance, but of silent longing, a reminder of a child she couldn't save and another she wasn't allowed to touch. And yet, even as he began to grasp her story, he felt a deeper unease rising inside him, because if Victoria had known about Lily for so long, then his daughter's life had never been as private as he believed. And as he stood there in the CEO's office surrounded by documents, memories, and truths he never asked for, Ethan realized that this meeting was not just about the past. It was about a future he might not be ready to face, because whatever Victoria Sterling knew about Lily's condition, her research, and her intentions was only beginning to surface, and somewhere beneath the layers of compassion and regret, there was still a secret waiting to be revealed. A secret that would force Ethan to confront the impossible question he had avoided for years. What if Lily's fate had been decided long before he ever walked into this building? The truth finally emerged not with drama or shouting, but with a quiet moment, so heavy it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. And as Ethan Carter stood across from Victoria Sterling in the Sumlit office where secrets had waited for 7 years to be spoken aloud, he felt something inside him shift from fear to fragile hope, because for the first time since Lily's diagnosis, he sensed that her story might not end in tragedy. Victoria moved back to her desk and opened her laptop, the soft glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes as she typed for a moment before turning it toward him. And on the display appeared medical charts, research data, and Lily's name highlighted in bold letters. And when Ethan leaned closer, his hands trembled as he realized that this was not just a record of his daughter's illness. It was a plan, detailed and precise, outlining a new experimental procedure that had never been made public, a treatment developed by Sterling Tech in partnership with a secretive medical institute, a procedure so advanced that it promised something doctors had never dared to offer him before, a real chance at curing Lily's heart condition. And as Ethan stared at the screen, his mind struggled to comprehend the meaning of those words, because hope had always felt dangerous, something that only made the pain worse when it failed. And yet here it was, glowing on a billionaire's laptop like a forbidden miracle. Victoria watched him silently before speaking, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This project was inspired by my son's death. I invested millions into research because I refused to accept that children should die from conditions we have the knowledge to fight." And she paused, her gaze lowering for a moment before rising again with quiet determination. When Lily's case appeared in the data, she became the reason I pushed this program forward. And Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat as he realized that his daughter had unknowingly become the center of a scientific breakthrough, a symbol of everything Victoria had lost and everything she still hoped to save. And yet reality quickly returned with brutal clarity when he whispered, "How much does it cost?" Because he already knew the answer would be impossible, and Victoria hesitated before replying softly, "More than $200,000. And the number hit him like a physical blow, dragging him back to the world of unpaid bills and empty bank accounts. And he let out a bitter laugh, not because it was funny but because it hurt too much to cry, lowering his eyes as he murmured, "I can't even afford a month of her medication. How could I ever afford that?" And for a moment the office was silent except for the distant hum of the city, until Victoria stood up slowly, walked around the desk, and stopped in front of him, her expression no longer that of a CEO negotiating contracts, but of a mother making a promise. And she said words that Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. "You won't pay for it." And he looked up sharply, unsure if he had heard correctly. And she continued, her voice firm, "I will." And before he could protest, she shook her head gently. Not as a business decision, not as charity, but as a human choice. And in that moment, Ethan felt tears rise to his eyes, because he had spent years believing that survival was a lonely battle, that no one outside his small apartment and hospital corridors cared about Lily's fate. And yet here stood a woman who had lost everything and still chose to fight for a child she barely knew. Weeks later, the hospital corridors that once felt like prisons became pathways of possibility as Lily was admitted for the groundbreaking procedure, and Ethan sat beside her bed every night, holding her small hand while machines beeped softly around them, remembering the day he had walked in a Sterling Tech with nothing but a delivery bag and left with a future he never imagined. And when the surgery finally began, hours stretched into eternity, his heart pounding with every passing minute until at last a doctor emerged with a tired smile and words that felt unreal. The procedure was successful, and Ethan collapsed into a chair, tears streaming down his face as relief flooded his body, because for the first time, Lily's life was no longer defined by fear, but by possibility. Months later, Lily ran across a park without gasping for breath, her laughter echoing through the air as Ethan watched her with a sense of gratitude so deep it almost hurt. And standing beside him was Victoria Sterling, no longer just a CEO or a distant benefactor, but someone who had become quietly woven into their lives. And as Lily ran toward them with a bright smile, she grabbed both their hands without knowing how much history connected them. And Ethan suddenly understood that sometimes the most powerful families are not created by blood, but by shared pain and courage. Back at Sterling Tech, Lily's photograph still hung on the wall of Victoria's office, but its meaning had changed forever. No longer a symbol of loss or silent longing, but a reminder that fate can be rewritten when people choose compassion over fear. And one evening, as Ethan prepared to leave after visiting Victoria, he paused at the doorway and asked the question that had lingered in his heart since the day they met. "Why did you really keep her picture all these years?" And Victoria smiled softly, her eyes resting on the frame as she replied, "Because sometimes the people we think we're watching are actually the ones saving us." And as Ethan stepped out into the city night, he realized that his daughter's life had been shaped not just by hardship, but by invisible connections and unexpected kindness. And that the shocking truth he had discovered on that ordinary day was not just that a billionaire CEO knew his child, but that in a world driven by money and power, a single photograph had quietly built a bridge between two broken hearts. And on that bridge, a miracle had been born.